Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar for Community Project Funding Grantees. I'm Randall Mullen with TDA Consulting, and I will further introduce myself in just a few moments along with the co-presenter. First, however, we would like to begin by covering a few logistics. If you participated in prior CPF cohort webinars, you probably know this detail. All participants will be muted during the webinar so that you will participate in listen mode. As is customary, the PowerPoint presentation slides will be available on the HUD Exchange soon after the webinar. You'll find the slides on the CPF landing page for the cohorts. Although you will participate in listen mode, we still want you to be actively engaged. You may submit content-related questions using the chat feature of Zoom, sending questions to everyone. The co-presenter and I will monitor the chat and answer clarifying questions when possible as they're asked during the presentation. We'll also pause, time permitting, at the end of each section of the webinar, read aloud the frequently asked questions, and orally answer them for all to hear. As in the prior webinars, we've reserved time for a Q&A period toward the end of the presentation, and we'll invite the HUD representatives to answer questions that became more difficult or clarify answers that we presenters may have provided earlier as necessary. Now, here's the agenda we'll follow today. As I mentioned, it will begin with introductions. I will introduce myself, followed by and others, including my co-presenter and the HUD representatives, followed by an overview of the cohort, as you see here. We will then also provide a general project description for the narrative that you are to complete and cover its format, as well as the specific content items bulleted, including the project description, project metrics, the timeline and status, as well as proposed subrecipients. We'll also introduce an activity that we would like for you to take, and we'll cover, as I mentioned, the Q&A period, and lastly, provide you with a homework assignment. Okay, again, my name is Randall Mullen. I'm with TDA Consulting, where I've worked for many years as both vice president and as a senior consultant on a wide range of community development projects. I've recently assisted HUD in explaining guidance around special congressional appropriations. That work has included both recovery from natural disasters and response to the COVID-19 pandemic, plus recovery from its associated economic impacts, and now the CPF program. The co-presenter today, as you see on this slide, is Chad Carson with Civics. Chad, will you please introduce yourself?
Hey, everyone. As Randall said, I'm Chad Carson with Civics. Looking forward to working with you all through community project funding. My background is, let's see, state government and working on federal grant programs from that side, as well as from the nonprofit and community development organization side. So yeah, looking forward to working with you all.
And we also have with us two HUD representatives, Connor LaRue. Connor, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hey, everyone. My name is Connor LaRue. I'm a program analyst with HUD, specifically with the Congressional Grants Division, and working to help provide TA efforts like this to all of you to help you all get to an executed grant agreement. I don't believe Eric is with us today, but I believe our Deputy Director is Chantel James, so I'll pass it on to her if she wants to say a few words and introduce herself.
Oh, good. Yes, Chantal.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. As Connor mentioned, I'm Chantel James, the Deputy Director of the Congressional Grants Division. Welcome. We really appreciate having you here. I hope this training will be very informative and get you the tools that you need to submit your grant packages. Thank you.
Thank you, Chantal. And Connor, we're glad to have you with us as well. The CPF cohort is assembled today to provide an opportunity for this webinar to give you guidance that would assist you, as Connor mentioned, in satisfactory completion of all the necessary grant materials. You are invited to join this cohort based on an award of a CPF grant. Session 1 will specifically assist you with completing the required information that leads to executing your grant agreement, and then turn attention to initiating the project itself. Your cohort will learn today about the project narrative, and then you will attend 3 additional sessions that are shown here, each at 2-week intervals. The additional sessions will cover budget, environmental review, and necessary forms which your community must complete as part of the required grant materials. Now, to facilitate and support the cohort, you're enrolled in what's called a learning management system, known as Absorb, which is hosted by TDA Consulting. The system will eventually extend beyond the delivery of the presentation of the 4 sessions. The LMS will feature useful resources as well as serve as a platform for office hour appointments offered to grantees. We'll now turn our attention to the key narrative content areas I previewed earlier. I'll briefly discuss the project description, and Chad will cover the other areas. If you're just starting to complete your grant materials, or you've been working on them for a while, you probably realize there is no prescribed format for the project narrative. It's understandable then that you might get stuck along the way. All the required content will cover several typewritten pages. However, HUD recognizes that you'll essentially begin with a blank page, and that itself can be a challenge for either those who are just starting or for those who are completing the necessary project description. Our best advice is to refer you, of course, to the CPF instructions, including those in the CPF grant guide, which details the required content. You may also refer to the standard form used for federal grant applications, that is the SF-424, and you may use this presentation as an outline for your narrative. The graphic appearing on this slide, as well as the presentation Chad and I are delivering, follows an outline structure that you may adapt for your project narrative. Again, it's not a prescribed format, but you will find it useful, particularly if you haven't started yet. Those who have already begun probably recognize that outline. It's closely aligned to the CPF grant guide itself. Okay, we'll now discuss the detailed content of the project description, beginning with the narrative, including elements of the name, the address, purpose, and details for a full narrative. A satisfactory project description begins with the seemingly simple task of identifying the project's name. The project name and other descriptive information must encompass the full scope of the project in its entirety. This is essential for HUD to review your grant package and the related materials. You will also need information to inform the level of environmental review necessary to gain clearance for your project. And that information must tie back to and match the joint explanatory statement, or the JES, of the congressional appropriation, unless it's corrected or amended. I'll elaborate on this point momentarily. Because there are literally thousands of these community project funding grants since Congress resumed appropriating funds for such uses, the description must also precisely identify the project location. You may provide an address if it is available. Otherwise, GPS coordinates are acceptable. You'll see in this example that we've planted a stake in the center of Washington, D.C., using its coordinates that may be recognized by the HUD representatives with us today. You're also encouraged to include a map depicting the site of the project if that enhances the project description. The narrative must also clearly describe your project's purpose. This may be as simple as a one-sentence summary describing what the project seeks to accomplish. However, in all cases, you absolutely must use language from the project scope appearing in the congressional record as part of the so-called JES. For example, if the JES describes construction of Great Gateway Plaza in your community, the narrative should also describe a proposed appropriation of funds for construction of Gateway Plaza. HUD has provided these examples of acceptable purpose statements appearing in submitted grant packages. For example, the Community Foundation of Indiana will construct a 12,000 square foot community center in Peoria, Illinois. The City of Omaha will launch a Main Street revitalization program, renovating the facades of historic storefronts on East Main Street. And the town of Gatlinburg will create an updated stormwater management plan. The full narrative then may summarize the entire project, restating the purpose, and most importantly, identifying activity categories and specific uses of the grant funds. Examples on this slide, such as affordable rental housing, capacity building, clearance and demolition, those will illustrate the point. They describe the actions that will be undertaken as part of the project, regardless of funding source. HUD recognizes many projects benefit from other sources of funding which contribute to the full scope and impact of your project. As such, this content area comprises the bulk of the narrative. Now, back to those examples, they are the common activity categories for a wide range of housing and community development projects. Use those activity categories as they will be helpful in the setup of your project within the HUD DRGR management information system once your grant agreement is signed and the funds can be spent. When you've finished drafting the project narrative, we advise you then to sit back and ask these three questions, which cover topics of potentially significant content. 1, did you include the congressional award language? 2, what pre-award costs, if any, are you seeking to reimburse under the grant agreement? And 3, was a federal environmental review completed prior to starting? Lastly, I want to mention the possibility of technical corrections to the congressional appropriation. As this slide indicates, if the JES had an error or if the project has substantially changed since announcement, some projects will require technical corrections. You should describe any known issues with the grantee name, project name, or description in conjunction with your grant officer. If a technical correction has been made, describe that change that has been made, including the specific change and the reason it was needed. Okay, that's it for the project narrative part of this presentation. I'll now turn over the remainder of the presentation to Chad. Chad?
Thanks, Randall. Let me just get my screen shared real quick. All right, so I'm going to be talking about project metrics for the narrative. All projects, all of these CPF projects are required to have clearly stated goals and outcomes. Much like the narrative itself, there's no prescribed format or number or way to do this. It's up to each grantee to develop their goals and outcomes and incorporate them into their narrative. So just a few examples: hold 6 community meetings to gather feedback on a city plan, construct 10 miles of walking paths, train 60 small business owners. You get the idea. They are measurable outcomes. Another performance measure that you will need to pay attention to is Section 3. Many of you might be familiar with Section 3 because it's required generally of all HUD funded projects, where they direct employment, training, and contracting opportunities to low-income individuals and businesses. It's a part of the Housing and Urban Development Act of 1968. And this is something that you report on, that you establish goals for and report on within the DRGR system that Randall mentioned earlier. Those performance measures will include the total number of labor hours that your project will require, the total number of Section 3 labor hours that your project will require, and then lastly, the subset of Section 3 labor hours, targeted Section 3 labor hours. If this all sounds like something that you are not super familiar with, HUD has put together guidance on reporting Section 3 labor hours into DRGR, and they are linked on this slide. We will be posting and sending out the slide deck after the presentation, so you'll have that link available. The other thing to keep in mind, this is not exactly a metric, but it's a compliance-related issue. We have the BABA, Buy America, Build America Act. And BABA requires that all iron, steel manufactured products, construction materials used in infrastructure projects that are federally funded use products that are made in the USA. Now, what's great is HUD has a general waiver for fiscal year 2023 grantees of BABA requirements. So for most of you, you won't have to worry about BABA. But if you plan on incorporating additional federal funds into your project, or anticipate additional funding in 2024 or beyond, you need to keep an eye on BABA and make sure that you're compliant. Again, HUD has made a really great quick guide for CPF grantees on BABA, and it's linked in this slide. All right, timeline and status. So your narrative should seek to address your current status of your project. It's critical that your grant officer understands where your project currently stands so that they can give you good advice. So your narrative needs to include a succinct explanation of where your project is within its lifespan. Is it just an idea at this point? Is it something that's been procured already, where you've hired contractors who will be doing the work? Is construction underway even? Where it stands is going to have a direct impact on a variety of regulatory issues. perhaps the most pressing of those being environmental review. So this current status part of the narrative is going to give your grant officer an idea of how they can best help you. And just as an FYI, if you have started construction and you do not have a cleared environmental, you need to contact your grant officer and regional environmental officer as soon as possible so they can get you on the right track. Your narrative also needs an estimated start date and end date. We recognize that at this stage, these are estimates. This is your best guess based on what you know at this time. We understand that these may change as the project evolves, and that's okay. Like I mentioned earlier, environmental review status is critical for the success of this project. You are required to adhere to NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, and you should incorporate into your narrative what steps have been taken towards environmental clearance. Again, it could be nothing. Hopefully, if it's nothing, your project has not begun yet. Or maybe you already have a full environmental assessment completed. We've got projects that range across that entire spectrum. So including information on where it stands, where your environmental stands, is very important. If you do not know who your regional environmental officer is, we've got the contact information linked right there on the slide. And it's also towards the end on our resource slide. You can pull it up and it's divided out by state. You can just follow the table across and see who your environmental officer is. Subrecipients. Now, not every grantee is going to have subrecipients, but some of you might want to use subrecipients to implement your project, and that is okay. What you need to be sure is clearly state in your narrative that you plan on using subrecipients, and you need to provide a justification for why the project is best implemented using subrecipients and not by the grantee itself. You also need to describe the role of the grantee versus the subrecipient, or each subrecipient if you're going to have multiple, and describe what each the grantee versus the subrecipient will be doing on the project. What will they be handling? What tasks and functions will they fulfill? So just explain how the project is going to be divided up with roles and responsibilities between grantee and subrecipient.
Chad, we have a couple of questions that I think we would want to pause and address now before we address the activity. The questions have partly concerned contact with the grant officers, and HUD is aware that there are occasionally changes to grant officers, and I believe where there are such changes, they do try to update the list. So the link that Connor provided in the chat should provide you with the current information. If you do not find that you can locate your current grant officer, Chad, what would you recommend that a grantee do?
If they have not been able to get in touch with their grant officer?
Yes, and Connor, if you wish to clarify here, that would probably be helpful to those who have posed that question.
Sure. Yeah, if you're having trouble getting in contact with your grant officer, what you can do is we have an AAQ section on the CPF HUD Exchange site. And so you can use the Ask a Question functionality of that website, select from the program drop-down CPF, so community project funding, and you can just indicate your name, your grant number, your contact information, and just say, hey, I'm having trouble getting in contact with my grant officer. And that way we can keep track of your request and send a request in to have your grant officer get in contact with you. And that's the easiest way for us to track those requests as they come in.
Thank you, Connor. We also have a question about the links working, and what I've responded is that once this presentation is completed, the PDF version of the slides is what will be posted, and those must go through a clearance routine to make certain that they are Section 508 compliant. That is, they can be accessed without limitations. And when that version of the slides are posted in PDF form, the links will be active, and click. You'll be able to essentially open up the PDF file, click on the link, and go to that particular site. If you were wanting to just find information based upon the term that you saw on the screen, you can also do a Google search. But if you want to be certain that you're reaching the correct resource and guidance, we would urge you to wait for the PDF version of the slides. Also, Chad will be going over a long list of resources that are available at the CPF landing page for the cohorts, and we would urge you to visit there, since it has been designed primarily for your purposes. We have one other question from our comment, actually, from a couple of people. Chad, it relates to the content being aimed at the early stages of a project submission. That is, when a grant has not been submitted for review, approval, and execution of a grant agreement. Those who've said this content may not be for you are right. This first session in this series of Cohort 2's 4-session webinars will follow the sequence that I described earlier, which begins with the project narrative, which we're covering today, followed by the budget, environmental review, and then the forms. It's really not until the 4th session where we would actually be describing those contents that are directly related to execution of the grant agreement. Connor, is there anything you would like to add as well for those participants who have already received their grant agreements and are wanting to know what next?
Yeah, for those of you that have submitted, your entire package, you're waiting on executed grant agreement. Our grant officers are currently working through a large backlog to get these packages approved and signed off by leadership. So you can always email your grant officer and ask for a status update. Again, if you're having trouble getting in touch with your grant officer, you can use the AAQ. But just be aware that we're working on getting executed grant agreements as fast as we can. And we're trying to get them out as soon as possible.
Okay, and we also have a question. I have a grant agreement, but have not ever submitted an application. It came with my award letter. What we're referring to is some of the representatives of grantees today have executed grant agreements. Your application, your award letter may contain information that is not fully completed, and that would be the elements of the grant award package. And Connor, feel free to offer further clarification here about the person who believe they have a grant agreement but never submitted the application.
Yeah, and that's correct. I mean, as part of the initial package that you get with your grant information, you will get a grant agreement, but it's not executed. So the whole point is to submit your entire grant package, narrative, budget, all of the required forms, have it approved by your grant officer. And then once that moves on and is approved, the grant agreement is signed by our department and sent back to you. And at that point, that's when you can get set up in DRGR and start drawing down funds. So that's what we mean by getting a grant agreement. It's really getting to an executed grant agreement that's signed by both parties.
Right.
Yep.
And Chad, we also have a question. Does the environmental review have to be completed before executing the grant agreement?
Ooh, Randall, I might kick that to you.
Well, I think it depends. The expectation is that you would not take any action that would compromise the necessary clearance for the use of your grant funds. And this is a matter that we would recommend, again, that you check out with your grant officer, as well as that list of environmental review officers who can provide you with more specific guidance in the respect of your project. For example, if the project involves only, say, delivery of a preparation of a plan, like that stormwater treatment plan that I mentioned in one of the three examples. The preparation of a plan obviously would not likely have significant environmental impacts, and consequently going through a shorter routine that documents that fact is all your officer may say is necessary. Whereas in the example that I'm seeing here, where it says we're doing repair and renovations to an existing structure, that reaches kind of an in-between area where, again, it depends on the extent of those repair and renovations. Certainly a new construction project would require a full environmental review. Those projects like you've described here, which involve repair to an existing structure, are likely to require a fuller environmental review. But it's possible that it would involve a relatively small amount of repairs, in which case it would possibly fall under the category of maintenance and would not require the full review. So what we're recommending is that, as mentioned earlier, and will be covered in detail in the session that follows the next topic, which is budget. It will be followed by environmental review. We would urge you to attend that session in addition to contacting both your grant officer and then, as appropriate, conferring with the environmental officer. Chad, do we have a follow-up question here in regard to our answers about environmental review?
We've got one from Chris, who asks if building an affordable housing project, not sure which comes first, environmental review or execution of grant agreement. And I think that is essentially what Randall just ran through. It's best handled by speaking with your environmental officer, regional environmental officer, who can guide you through that process.
And when you submit your grant application, the review will partly determine what is necessary to fulfill the conditions of that grant agreement. And if your project is of a greater significance and requires further review, that will have been identified, and your grant officer would be able to steer you in the right direction. If what we're talking about, though, is and the point is you cannot take irreversible actions with the use of the grant funds. They're called choice limiting actions. Those are what you must avoid. And simply executing a grant agreement doesn't cross that line. That's simply signing an agreement. It's not taking an action. But once you have an executed agreement, then you have the authority to proceed with your project with limits as specified in what might be grant conditions, which typically specify that you must satisfy the necessary environmental review requirements for your specific project. So what Chad referenced is exactly correct. We would urge you to, again, confer with your grant officer, and we've also included a list or link that you will find is active in the PDF version of these slides related to the environmental officers that serve your part of the United States. Connor, is there anything?
I did want to quickly specify the environmental contacts are also listed in the grant officer assignment sheet that was which the link was posted in the chat. So yeah, you can use that as reference.
Yeah. Any other questions before we go on to the activity?
I see we've got John asking, in the instance of having multiple project sites, should he provide a list of addresses in addition to a map? How best to describe those multiple sites? I think a list of the addresses is a great way to do that. I think that is sufficient for your multiple sites.
And we also have a question about how do you get a login for DRGR, and Connor's answered that question, indicating that DRGR access, that is access to HUD's management information system, is granted only once your grant agreement is fully executed. It is actually through that system that you will also submit your draw requests and receive reimbursement. So it's very closely tied to execution of the grant agreement itself.
Oh, okay. Christina asked, was the Section 3 estimates answered? No, it wasn't. Let me go back to the Section 3 slide real quick.
Sure.
And we can talk about it again. For the purposes of your narrative, you do not need to estimate the specific number of labor hours, Section 3 labor hours, targeted labor hours. In the narrative, it would be best to acknowledge that there is a Section 3 requirement and touch on how you're going to handle that. Acknowledge that you're going to have to deal with Section 3 compliance. The actual plugging in of estimated performance measures values are going to go into DRGR when you get access after you execute your grant agreement. Does that answer your question, Christina, and the person who did the first Section 3 question? Excellent. Okay.
All right.
D. Haney is asking, how do we receive our key name? Maybe you mean your grant officer. Your grant officer is assigned based on state, and there's a link in this chat that Connor shared that has the matchup of who has which state. And
really quick, I'm wondering if key name, maybe they mean their grant number or their grant name, in which case you can also reach out to your grant officer and request that information for them too.
Awesome. Thank you, Connor. And D. Haney, chime in if that's not what you meant.
Looking back over the questions, Chad, I see that we also have one that was not answered in respect to an example of a subrecipient. And if you like, I'll take that question.
Yeah.
When Chad referred to identifying your proposed subrecipients, he was relating instructions that call upon the grantee, which is seeking the CPF grant funding, to identify any organizations to which the grantee will be passing through funds, to obtain assistance in carrying out all or part of the project. We're not referring to, for example, those services that you may pay for related to the general administration of your grant, but those that are more associated with the delivery of your grant. And I will be sharing with you in the activity an example of where there likely would be subrecipients for the grantee. Think of them as your partners who are carrying out part of the project in its entirety, and where you are anticipating that they will play a role in achieving the purposes of your stated project description. You want to identify them in the manner that Chad has identified here. Their role and the place they will take in the scope of the project, the tasks and functions that they need to keep up with. Chad, did you want to add anything in answer to that question?
Just to add on, Christina said, so contractors are not subrecipients. For example, architects, engineers,
Correct.
consultants. That is correct.
Yes.
I think I've got one more question. D. Haney was clarifying that they're looking for the TDA learning environment, learning management system key name. And we will have the folks running the learning management system reach out to you. If you can just send your contact information through the chat directly to me, that would be great.
Okay.
So it's time for an activity.
It's time for an activity. Yes, indeed. Let's take a look at the project description in the example that I referenced earlier in response to one of those questions. Appearing on this slide is a sample project description. And as I explained earlier, a grantee's project description should identify the exact activity, its entire scope, the sources of funding, and other details which tie back to the congressional appropriation. This is also a place where you would, to that earlier point, identify those elements of your project that will be carried out by proposed subrecipients. The column on the left identifies a fish hatchery project. It's commonly referred to as Bertram's Garden. And the grantee highlighted summary that's under project summary indicates funds will design and construct a new watershed, education, and restoration complex on previously acquired land. The center column in this slide is taken as a page from the congressional record and lists the joint explanatory statement in the on the left-hand side of the page, which indicates for what purpose Congress is appropriating funds to the hatchery. And as you see there, the JES indicates that funds have been appropriated for land acquisition. What is the appropriate grantee action in this case? You see that there are three choices shown in red on the right column of this slide. And the first is to simply submit the project grant application as is. The second is to contact the grant officer for further guidance. And then the third choice is to request your member of Congress to become involved and intervene. We're now going to ask you to indicate which choice you would make if your project were this fish hatchery project and you were confronted with the need to take appropriate action. So we're going to launch a poll and ask that you pick one of those three choices.
All right, looks like the poll has gone live.
Yes. And we'll give you a few minutes to respond. There are approximately 100 participants in today's webinar on project narrative, so we'll wait until we see a representative group who have chosen to answer and stick their neck out on what they would do confronted with the information presented in these three panels. And as we see the answers start to lag, we will draw the poll to an end. So if you haven't made a selection yet, please indicate whether you would submit the project description with the grant application as it appears in the left side of this slide. Second, you would contract the grant officer for guidance, or third, you would request that your member of Congress who obtained the funds for you intervene.
Are we ready to end the poll?
I think we are, yes. It
All
looks like we have 80 of the roughly 100 participants, which is a good response. And what are the results, Chad?
Can you see them?
I can. I wanted to ask you what it looks like.
I think they're showing on the screen.
Yes.
Awesome. So
the contract grant officer should be contacted for guidance. That is your answer. And I think we can maybe pause now and indicate that it would probably not be appropriate to simply submit the project description. What you would then want to explain is the reason for the discrepancy. And we have not asked you that, but maybe you could just take a moment to enter into the chat why you picked, most of you, 78% of you picked contact grant officer for guidance. Why would you feel that was necessary? And let's see what answers we get in the chat. Chad? I see number 2, need to revise the JES. Okay.
Christina, that's not wrong. We did say that previously.
Correct. Yes, the grant officer would be the most informed. It appears there would be a technical change to the scope. When you're not sure what you're doing, contact the grant officer. Yes.
That is good guidance.
And the best summation there is because there is a discrepancy between the JES, the intent of Congress, if you will, to fund the land acquisition, and the project summary reads, led jointly by the John Bertram Association and the Partnership for the Blue River Estuary. The project will design and construct a new watershed education and restoration complex on previously acquired land at Bertram's Garden. Therein lies the the discrepancy. And it's possible that, as Karen mentioned, that this is a matter of timing. It's entirely possible that originally the project required land being acquired, and somehow what the member of Congress requested lagged with the current status of the project, where there's previously acquired land, and the requested use of funds is, quote, to design and construct that complex on that previously acquired land. And clearly, contacting the grant officer would enable you to take the correct step, and a determination would be made. There is guidance that HUD has recently provided its staff, including the grant officers, regarding when there would be a change that requires a technical correction. What I would observe here is that this is very much a glaring difference, and as such, it would seem almost certain that a technical correction would be required in this instance. And as Corinne asked, can you give an overview of the process? Maybe I'll pause and see if Connor wants to try to answer that question, but I'm imagining that it largely depends on a lot of different circumstances. Do you want to, or does Chantel want to address that question, Connor?
I want to defer to Chantel if she's available right now, because I think she has a better handle on the system than me.
And while we're trying to get Chantal to possibly address the question, Connor has placed in the chat a link to a congressional record that includes the joint explanatory statements for the FY23 CPF grant awards. And you can see it's important to capture the page range, because that is a very lengthy document running hundreds and hundreds of pages, and you want to find the pages that particularly relate to the CPF grant awards.
And I'm sorry, I think Chantal must have dropped off. I can try to give a little bit of insight on the process for the technical corrections. So technical corrections, getting a technical correction is not a streamlined process. It can be sort of a lengthy process, and it's generally a last resort to where the activities that an organization is trying to undertake with their funding is not at all matching up with the JES. If that's happening, that's something you definitely need to contact your grant officer about, and the grant officer will have to elevate it up to our leadership staff. But yeah, it's generally not an easy fix. Most grantees will not need a technical correction. If changes are needed, typically they can be made simply through an award amendment, which again is something that can be done by working with your grant officer. But that process is definitely less time intensive and more streamlined than a technical correction.
Thank you, Connor. Earlier, I did mention that I wanted to illustrate the role of a subrecipient that might be proposed in a grant project. And if you again look at the project summary, and I realize that this isn't, this is actually a file that was provided by a slightly different grantee. We're trying to protect their identity. And as such, this document has been altered to protect that identity. But what it does note is that this grantee, Bartram Association, is acting in partnership with the Blue River Estuary. And that Blue River Estuary group very likely would be a proposed subrecipient. And I don't know actually the full details on this project, but it's possible that the partnership for the Blue River Estuary is what has provided the land that will be used for the design, for the construction of the new watershed education and restoration complex. And if this grant, which is a $2 million grant, includes funding for not just the design and construction, but perhaps equipment and the interpretive elements of such a facility, it's possible that an educational institution would be involved as well, and as such, there might be other proposed subrecipients as well. It's important to note that in those instances, those entities have a distinctively separate role and responsibility, with the Partnership for Blue River Estuary presumably playing a big role, not that of the architect or the eventual contractor who is going to build the complex, but share as a partner in the development of this community project and the facility that it creates. Chad, do we have any other questions that were generated by this example?
I think we've addressed everything.
Okay. Well, we can resume the presentation then.
All right, so resources. There are a bunch in this slide deck, and I just want to show you some of them. Let me share a different window. So the first resource we have is this list of grant officers and regional environmental officers. So there's a hyperlink to this in the chat. There's a hyperlink to this in the slide deck. You can just find your state, scroll across, see who your grant officer is and who your environmental officer is. So great resource if you're just starting out, don't know who to go to. The next resource that hopefully y'all have all been to is the program website for community project funding on HUD.gov or HUDexchange.info, HUD's website. Here you can view the grant guides. There's one specifically for your fiscal year 2023, and access a bunch of different resources that will guide you through the process. This is kind of the home base for all things CPF. Specifically, the grant guide is the resource for this program. There's a version for fiscal year 2022 and a version for fiscal year 2023. So make sure you access the right one.
And presumably those of you who are participating in today's webinar and the series that follows have been awarded funds under fiscal year 2023. So the guide version that Chad is sharing with you now is the one that you want to reference.
Yep, and it's almost 50 pages of how-to for this grant. The next, this is the HUD regional environmental officers, just some more contact information by region of who, but this is also restated on the first document that I shared, this table here. And then the last resource, I referenced it in the chat. It's the HUD Ask a Question help desk. There is a section specifically for community project funding. And I mentioned this as a possible avenue if you have tried to get in touch with your grant officer and you can't. or if you've run into any other intractable issue, submit a question through this help desk. It's assigned a ticket number, it's trackable, it goes up through HUD management. So this can be a tool if you're not getting any traction on just some plain old emails. So there's a link in the chat and a link in the presentation. And then the last resource listed on the slide deck was CPF desk guides. And those are a resource that is still to come. We are building those desk guides using feedback that we receive in these very trainings. So all of the questions that have been entered into the chat, thank you so much for those. We aim to design the desk guide to answer those questions, and we are getting real life feedback from you all. So thanks. And when those are published, all of the grantees will receive an email with links. So questions and answers. We've received a bunch as the meeting has gone on. Let's see if there's any that we still need to answer.
Yeah, as you were covering the resources, Chad, I looked back to see if all the questions were answered. We do have one new question that came in. If we have a project narrative drafted, can we share it with you during your office hours to get feedback on it if they are comprehensive? And that is an excellent question. And I'm happy to say the answer is yes. In fact, that's the whole point of the office hours. And if you're representing a grantee that has benefited from this webinar, you have just begun preparing your project narrative, and you want feedback, you have not yet submitted it, and you have the opportunity to, for example, better identify the location where there might be multiple sites involved, or you have an issue around the tie back to the congressional appropriation, the JES, or you're uncertain whether you need to include reference to the full range of sources of funding, as in that example with Bertram's Gardens, where they perhaps have already received funding for the recently acquired property, perhaps donated or provided through fundraising by the Blue River Estuary Partnership. You would be able to ask Chad and me those questions. We anticipate having other people participate in the office hours, including Connor and HUD staff, with the likelihood that even representatives of grant officers, not necessarily your grant officer, but those who field questions from grantees like the grantee you represent, can actually offer guidance, hedging it, of course, to note that it's important that you, again, make contact with your own grant officer and eventually obtain feedback from them in respect to your project narrative before you complete the budget and the other elements that we'll cover in session 4 related to the forms and other elements of the grant submission packet. Do we have another question or two here, Chad?
It looks like we've got Shauna asking, do we submit before office hours to give you a chance to review, or submit them during office hours?
Yeah, you may just share them with us during office hours. What we have found, at least in the first cohort, and you are part of a second cohort, is that the attendance in the office hours has not been so overwhelming that we cannot answer questions, at least where you might first post a question in the chat, and then if it becomes useful, quickly share your particular question. We would ask that you be respectful of others who are in the office hours session. It's not a single one-on-one type of appointment. However, there will be the opportunity for additional, more direct guidance, details to follow at a later time.
And then we've got one more question. It looks like we've recently engaged a grant writer to complete this process. Can the grant writer be included in these sessions?
I don't see why not. Connor, do you want to
No,
offer
I
any?
don't think so. I mean, if you have extra staff that are working on the administration of your CPF award, I think it's appropriate that they attend sessions if it's going to help them, submit your grant package and get executed and administer your award. So no, if TDA doesn't have a problem with it, I think that
Not at
we're
all.
okay as well. Yeah.
In fact, I would encourage those who maybe have questions and are wanting certain members of your team to hear the answers to those questions, like the grant writer. It's probably advisable, and those office hour sessions will again go into as much detail as time permits during it is a 1 hour period, not a 90-minute period. So we'll just have 60 minutes together, but Chad and I'll do our best to cover all of the questions and give you feedback related to every element of the project narrative.
And really quick, and I think Randall, you already mentioned it, but the participants on this office hour session will include some grant officers. They actually might even be the grant officers that are assigned to you in your particular award. And so between those grant officers and the staff here at TDA, we'll be able to workshop your questions and get some answers for you. So we really do encourage you to attend the office hours and work through any nagging problems that maybe you haven't been able to deal with up until this point. But those are going to be really, really helpful sessions if you're able to attend.
Yes, and we're delighted at TDA Consulting to have HUD representatives to this extent participate in these webinars and the office hours sessions. You can well imagine that this is in many respects a key to you being able to meet your community's needs with the appropriated funds for your project. I did see comments that observed how sometimes it's been difficult, especially coming out of the holidays, to make contact with your grant officer. Others have noted that there are time pressures to complete the project for your community. We get that, and it's to HUD's credit that they're marshaling all the necessary resources to give you the support that you require to see that your project becomes a reality. If there are no other questions, I think you can go on to the remaining slides, Chad.
So next up, homework. You might have thought you were out of the woods with homework once you left school, but you are not.
Yeah.
So the cohort session that follows this one is all about your project budget. So in preparation for that budget session, we would like you to start going through the budgeting process. In your project narrative, first, you want to make sure that you're describing all sources of funding that are being used in your project, and start compiling those into a detailed budget of covering all sources and uses of the funding. So what funds or what sources of funding will be used to pay for the project, and what is it going to be spent on? And you can come with that information in mind to the budget session, which is February 6th, 2024. It's another Tuesday, just like this, same time, from 2 p.m. to 3:30 p.m. Eastern time. And you can get some expert advice from our team who has been working on budget issues. Lastly here, we're providing you with Randall's email address and my email address. If you have any follow-up questions, if you need anything related to this presentation, don't hesitate to shoot us an email. The last thing here is that we want to hear how we did today. Each participant is going to receive an email with a link to a survey. If you can take some time to fill out that survey, it really helps us do better, make sure that our cohorts are as helpful as possible for you all. So please take a few minutes. You also can jump in and do the evaluation right now if you want to scan that QR code on the screen. And if not,
and while we allow participants time to begin completing their evaluation using the QR code, I will reiterate that the Department of HUD will be making available the presentation slides that Chad and I have used today, including the active links that I referenced, and those will be posted to the HUD Exchange and the CPF landing page that Chad navigated through his computer to at the HUD Exchange, and you will be able to obtain the slides from there. You will not receive an email as Olivia had asked, but rather you will want to keep in mind that it will take a period of several days for the clearance to occur. But once it does, HUD is determined to post those slides in such a manner where you will be able to access them and reference them in conjunction with the FY23 CPF guide that Chad also shared with you, which would guide you in regard to completion of the project narrative and as well as the budget. There's a request that we go to the preceding slide. Shauna would like to see it, and maybe if you're wanting our contact information, that's it. If there's something else, oh, it's slide 34. Okay. Yes, and if you were wanting to see the dates of the other deliveries, you can maybe, Chad, go back to the start of the presentation where I went over those dates, or at least showed on the screen the dates. I believe that was, I'll look at my notes here. That was
sure,
slide.
I'm just giving Shauna a second to look at this slide.
Okay.
This was the one that they were looking for.
Oh, okay. All right. I was looking down to find the slide for the other dates. And when you're finished sharing this slide number 33, you can navigate to slide 6, which contains the overview of the cohort 2. And the project narrative occurred today. The budget, as Chad mentioned, in looking forward to the next webinar, it's February 6th from 2 to 3:30 p.m. Eastern. All these times are Eastern. The environmental review topic will be taken up 2 weeks later on February 20th. And then the topic of the forms will be addressed on March 5th. And you will receive notification as a member of Cohort 2 about each of these upcoming webinars in addition to the office hours. You're welcome, Shauna. Any other parting questions or comments before we say goodbye? Okay, well, on behalf of TDA Consulting and the Department of HUD, we very much appreciate your active participation. This was a good start to cohort number 2, and both Chad and I look forward to seeing you at the office hours and noting your active participation in subsequent sessions on the subject of your community project funding grant awards. Goodbye.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, CDA. Thank you, everyone.